Welcome to Pillowtime Lore, where dreams take shape and stories wrap around you like your favorite blanket. You've made it through the day, and now it's time to slow down, breathe deeply, and drift into a world made just for you. So, fluff up your pillow, snuggle into your coziest spot, and let your eyes get heavier with each word. This is your moment. No to-do lists, no noise, just stillness and a little magic. With each breath in, feel the tension melt from your shoulders. With each breath out, let go of everything that doesn't serve your peace. You're safe here. Tonight's story is soft and soothing, like a warm cup of tea for your thoughts, carefully crafted to calm your busy mind and help you drift gently into sleep. So close your eyes, dear dreamer. Let your imagination wander while I carry you into a land where anything is possible and everything ends in peace. This is Pillowtime Lore. The sun in Elderbrook was different. It wasn't the blazing, screen glare kind of sun Aaliya was used to in the city. It was gentler, filtered through thick canopies of leaves, making sleepy golden puddles on the cobbled streets. But even that charm couldn't change how utterly bored she felt. Aaliya stood by her grandmother's gate, arms folded, wearing an oversized t-shirt and unmatched socks. Her parents had flown off to Qatar for work just for a year. They said but left her in this WIFD-previved village with spotty mobile signal and no one her age. There was one small store that sold everything from onions to nail cutters, and the only sound most afternoons was the clinking of her Nani's teacups and the neighborhood rooster having an identity crisis at 2 p.m. Go explore, her Nani said one morning, gently brushing her silver braid over her shoulder. This village is old, but full of stories, Aaliya groaned, but grabbed her canvas, tote, and headed out anyway, needing an escape from the smell of doll and boredom. She walked past empty fields, sleepy goats, and the same 5 houses that seemed to be copy-pasted from one another. Then she spotted something she hadn't noticed before, a crooked, wooden sign, half swallowed by vines. The bookshop beneath the sycamore tree. She paused. A massive sycamore tree stood like a silent guardian over a small brick building tucked just behind the road. Its bark was pale and peeling like an old secret, and the leaves fluttered in the wind like whispering pages curious. Aaliya pushed open the creaky wooden door. Bell tinkled somewhere overhead. The inside was dim, but warm. Wooden shelves lined every wall, bursting with books of every shape and size. A cat with a missing ear yawned from the counter, and behind a stack of old encyclopedias stood a man with wiry glasses, his beard snow-white and eyes kind. You're late, he said, without looking up. Late for what? For discovering this place, he replied, finally smiling. You're Aaliya, aren't you? Mariam's granddaughter. She blinked. How do you? Elderbrook has 200 people. News travels faster than the internet. He chuckled, tapping the counter. I'm Yusuf. I run this place. Or maybe it runs me, who knows anymore? Aaliya wandered through the aisles, trailing her fingers across the dusty spines. There were books on everything: gardening, moon phases, maps of imaginary lands, poetry in languages she didn't recognize. Do people even come here? She asked some, when they need something but don't know what. This shop gives you what you don't realize you're looking for. Aaliya raised an eyebrow. That's vague and slightly creepy. Yusuf just smiled. You'll see. As she turned to leave, he called out, I could use help here. Just a few hours. Organizing, cleaning, maybe helping customers when they drop by. Aaliya hesitated. Why me? Because you're curious. And because the shop seems to like you. She laughed awkwardly, but something inside her stirred. Maybe it was the smell of old books, or the warmth of the wooden floor. Maybe it was the way Yusuf had said it. So simply, like she already belonged. Fine, she said. But if I end up trapped in some magical cursed library, no curses here, Yusuf promised with a wink. Just stories waiting to be read, and just like that, Aaliya's worst summer ever began to quietly unravel into something she couldn't yet name, but it smelled like paper and adventure. Aaliya started working at the bookshop. Working at the bookshop quickly became Aaliya's favorite part of the day. Each morning, she'd walk past the sleepy general store, wave at the two old men who always played chess under the banyan tree, and slip into the cool shade of the giant sycamore. The shop always smelled faintly of cinnamon and ink, and Aaliya liked how time seemed to slow the moment she stepped inside. Yusuf gave her simple tasks: dusting the shelves, organizing books by color, not genre, oddly, and writing the daily quote on a little chalkboard by the door. Today's quote read, "Some stories find us when we need them most." At first, she didn't talk much, but Yusuf did, in his quiet, thoughtful way. He told her about the books that misbehaved, ones that always fell off the shelf when someone was meant to read them, or how some books refused to be sold twice. They choose their reader, he said matter-of-factly, handing her a stack of ancient novels. Always have. Books don't have legs, Aaliya said. Neither do trees. Yet they know when to let go, he replied, sipping his tea slowly. The village of Elderbrook began to reveal its quirks, especially through the shops. Regulars. Miss Parveen came in every Friday at noon, borrowed a book she swore she'd return, then never did. She always said, I just need one more week. But Aaliya noticed she left bookmarks at page 5. Always page 5. Then there was Mr. Hanif, tall, grumpy, and obsessed with cookbooks. He'd sit for hours flipping through Mastering Mughlai or Pastries for the Soul. But when Aaliya asked what he'd cooked last, he muttered something about burnt toast and left in a hurry. I think people come here less for books, Aaliya whispered one day while dusting, and more to feel like themselves again. Yusuf smiled like she'd passed a test she didn't know she was taking. Later that afternoon, Yusuf handed her a small hardcover with a faded red spine. "This one's for you," Aaliya frowned. "The Wind's Fifth Door." "I don't remember reading this," she said, flipping through the pages. "Memory's funny." Yusuf replied, "Sometimes stories stay even when we forget the names." She turned to a dog-eared page and froze. It hit her all at once, the feeling of being 6, curled up in her father's lap as he read her this very book, the way he'd make silly voices for each character, how she'd believed, truly believed, that doors could fly if you whispered the magic word. Aaliya blinked fast. "I forgot this," she whispered. "All of it. Books remember for us," Yusuf said softly. "That's why they matter." That evening, Aaliya stayed longer, watching the soft, golden light filter through the window panes. She shelved the red book gently, like it was something sacred. For the first time since arriving in Elderbrook, she didn't feel like an outsider. She belonged, not just to the shop or the stories, but to a little piece of herself. She thought she'd lost, and just like that, the summer no longer felt wasted. It was becoming a story she might actually want to tell. It started with silence. Every afternoon, at exactly 4:10 p.m., the bell above the bookshop door gave a delicate jingle, and the girl walked in, head down, steps careful, always holding a weathered blue notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. She didn't speak, not to Yusuf, not to Aaliya. She'd drift silently through the aisles, run her fingers across the book spines like they were piano keys, and sit cross-legged in the poetry corner, scribbling furiously in that notebook. It happened 5 days in a row. On the 6th day, Aaliya finally asked Yusuf, "Do we know her?" Yusuf looked over his glasses. "We do, but we're pretending we don't. She needs the quiet." Aaliya watched the girl from behind the counter, curiosity gnawing at her. She looked their age, maybe a year older, with short, choppy hair and ink-stained fingers. The kind of person who always looked like they were halfway inside a thought. On the 7th day, she left her notebook behind. Just for a second, she'd rushed out when it began raining, and the notebook slipped under the beanbag where she'd been sitting. Aaliya picked it up carefully. She didn't open it. Well, not entirely. But the edge of a page peeked out, and she saw one line scrawled in messy handwriting. "Some silences are heavier than thunder." It hit her like a whisper shouted into a canyon. Later that evening, Yusuf noticed the girl hadn't returned. Maybe today was the day the storm got too loud, he said quietly. The next morning, Aaliya walked to the shop early and placed something on the poetry shelf. The Sky Within Us. A slim book of poems her grandfather once read to her when she was going through her own lonely patch. When Sarah came the next day, her usual silence felt shakier. Her eyes scanned the shop as if she could tell something had changed. When she found the poetry book, she didn't pick it up right away. She just stood there. Later, after everyone had left, Aaliya found something fluttering in the poetry corner. A poem, handwritten, pinned to the wooden beam with a paperclip. I stopped writing the day my house turned into a whisper and my father became a picture frame. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be the next day. Another visitor, an elderly woman who usually came for romance novels, noticed the poem. She smiled, pulled a page from her handbag, and added one of her own. Something about lost love and second chances, and then another appeared. A short, clumsy haiku about coffee, a note about grief, a sketch of a bird with the words still flying scrawled underneath. Soon, the beam became a wall of quiet voices. I didn't start it, Aaliya told Yusuf one evening, watching a teenager tape up a lyric about hope. No, Yusuf said, but you invited it. Sarah returned daily now. She still barely spoke, but sometimes she smiled, and when she handed Aaliya her notebook, it was open. Thank you, it read. I thought my words had left me. Turns out they were just waiting to be read again, and just like that, the bookshop wasn't just a shop anymore. It was a place where people brought their silence and left with a little less of it. It was a Thursday morning when the sky hung low and heavy, casting a pale gray light over Elderbrook, the kind of morning that made everything feel slow and thoughtful. Aaliya had arrived early at the bookshop, determined to finally tackle the forbidden corner, an entire shelf Yusuf jokingly warned her about on her first day. It was where abandoned books went to collect dust, and forgotten titles sank into silence. No one really touched it. I'd clean it myself, Yusuf had said once, but I'm afraid I'll find my own hairline in there. Today, Aaliya rolled up her sleeves, tied her hair into a bun, and crouched beside the shelf. The books here were old. Some had cracked leather covers. Others smelled like attics and long summers. As she shifted a few out of the way, something heavy fell behind the wooden panel. Curious, she pried it out an ancient hardback titled The Garden Between Us. Its cover was worn and faded, the edges frayed like a beloved sweater. She was about to toss it into the unsavable pile when she noticed the binding was uneven. Aaliya pressed her fingers along the spine. It crunched slightly, like something had been wedged inside. Her heartbeat quickened. Carefully, she peeled back the loosened lining and pulled out a thin, folded envelope. It was yellowed. The ink faded, but she could still make out the words. For Zahida, if you ever find this. Her breath caught. Zahida was her grandmother's name. She turned the envelope over. The sender wasn't signed, but the handwriting was familiar, delicate, slanted slightly to the right. It was her Nana's handwriting, shaking slightly. Aaliya opened it. My dearest Zahida, if you're reading this, it means I either hid this too well, or Yusuf never did get around to reorganizing the shelves. Either way, I'm glad there's a kind of bravery in paper, don't you think? It lets you say things you didn't have the courage to speak aloud. You always believed in people, in their second chances, in their stories. I used to think books were just ink and pages. You showed me they were mirrors, and together, we dreamed of this place, this shop, where stories wouldn't just be sold, but shared. I was too tired, too afraid, too busy being practical to build that dream. But Yusuf wasn't, and neither were you. Maybe someone younger will come along one day and pick up where we left off. Maybe that someone will be someone we love. Maybe she'll have your spark. Maybe she'll find this. Tell her. The stories matter, even the quiet ones. Especially the quiet ones. Aaliya just sat there, the letter trembling in her hands. She read it again and again, and then, clutching the envelope tightly, she ran home. Her Nani was sitting in the courtyard, sipping chai, wrapped in her favorite shawl, even though it was July. Aaliya didn't say anything, just handed her the letter. Her grandmother read it slowly, her fingers shaking slightly at the corners. When she reached the last line, she pressed the paper to her lips and closed her eyes. She didn't cry loudly. She wasn't that kind of woman, but Aaliya saw the tear slipped quietly down her cheek. I thought it was lost, Nani whispered. He wrote it the summer before he passed. He used to come to this shop every day. You know, back when it was just Yusuf and 1,000 dreams and broken shelves. He wanted this place to be more, Aaliya said softly. Nani nodded. Not just a shop, a space where people healed, where books found the right people, where silence was allowed and stillness was sacred. Aaliya didn't speak. Her heart felt stretched wide open, filled with love and sadness and something new. Later that evening, she brought the letter back to the shop. Yusuf didn't seem surprised when she handed it to him. I wondered when you'd find it, he said gently. Your grandfather, he left little pieces of himself here, in every corner. Aaliya looked around. The shop didn't feel dusty anymore. It felt alive. She stood by the poetry corner, gazed at the wall of quiet voices, and felt something settle inside her, a sense of direction. Her summer had started as an escape, but now it felt like a beginning. It started with a folded flyer, bright, glossy, and completely out of place in the cozy world of the bookshop. The paper was taped to the notice board outside the local tea stall. Aaliya spotted it one morning on her way to the shop, a corner, flapping in the wind like it didn't belong. Coming soon, Silver Sky Plaza, luxury shopping, right in the heart of Elderbrook. Her eyes scanned the fine print, and a sick feeling pooled in her stomach. The listed address was exactly where the sycamore tree stood, quietly shelving a new donation of books. He didn't turn when she stormed in and slapped the flyer down on the counter. I saw it, he said simply. That's it, she snapped. They're going to build a shopping mall here. Here, Yusuf. This place, this shop, this tree. I know, he said again, gently. Sit down. But Aaliya couldn't sit. Her hands trembled, her chest burned. You knew, and didn't say anything. He finally turned to her, and she noticed how tired his eyes looked. Eyes that had seen generations of stories, of people, of change. I hoped it wouldn't be real, but a lawyer came by yesterday. They offered money, quite a lot. Promised they'd relocate the shop into one of the plaza units. Relocate the "This isn't a burger joint." I know, Yusuf whispered again. Quieter this time. Aaliya sat down, her legs suddenly heavy. Are you going to sell it? Yusuf didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer behind the counter and pulled out an old photo. Yusuf, her, Nana, and 2 other villagers, standing in front of the freshly painted shop under a much smaller sycamore tree. We planted this tree together, he said, tapping the photo with our hands. That was 40 years ago. We wanted a place where stories could grow like branches, not just be sold. Aaliya's throat tightened, then fight for it. He looked at her, surprised. You think we can win? I don't know, she said, but we can try. That evening, Aaliya started her mission. First, neighbors came out of their homes. But I haven't even finished Pride and Prejudice. This can't happen. Next, Mr. Hanif, the non-cooking cookbook reader. Without this shop, he said, how will I not learn to bake banana bread every week? By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. Some villagers were outraged. AC, fast food, a real cinema. But what about soul? Said Miss Parveen, clutching Pride and Prejudice to her chest like a shield. Aaliya created flyers titled Save the Sycamore and posted them on lampposts, tea stalls, even the post office. She and Sarah, who had grown more confident since returning to poetry, started a petition. Within 3 days, they had 74 signatures. I haven't seen this kind of spirit in Elderbrook in years, he murmured. Then came the town hall meeting, an economic revitalization, and handed out brochures of marble floors and escalators. When she paused for questions, Aaliya stood up. This isn't empty land, she said. It's a living, breathing place. People came here to find pieces of themselves, to remember, to heal. The woman raised an eyebrow. It's just a bookshop. No, Aaliya said fiercely. It's a sanctuary. Sarah stood next, then Miss Parveen, then Mr. Hanif, then Yusuf. Last of all, if you tear it down, you don't just take wood and bricks, you erase stories, and stories are stronger than concrete. Silence filled the hall. Then someone clapped, then two. Then the room erupted in applause. The council promised to consider. It wasn't over, but it wasn't lost either. Back at the bookshop, under the shade of the sycamore tree, Aaliya sat with Yusuf and Nani, reading the letter again. Maybe this was what her grandfather meant. Maybe she was the spark, and she wasn't going to let it go out. It began with string lights. Aaliya and Sarah spent the morning hanging them from the low branches of the sycamore tree, careful not to tug too hard on the aging limbs. As the sun filtered through the golden leaves, the little bulbs caught the light like stars waiting for night to fall. Do you think anyone will actually come? Sarah asked, stepping back to admire their work, her blue notebook tucked under her arm. Aaliya grinned. They'll come. They just need a reason to remember. The flyers had gone out 3 days earlier. The gathering, one night of stories, songs, and stars under the sycamore tree. A celebration, a protest, a prayer. It was hard to describe, but it felt important. Yusuf, though skeptical, let her run with the idea. He stood near the entrance of the bookshop that afternoon, polishing an old wooden sign that simply read, "Welcome." I haven't seen this many people excited in a long time, he said, watching the villagers gather in small groups nearby. Even Miss Parveen wore a new shawl. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Elderbrook, people started to arrive. Brought tea. Aaliya's cousin arranged a small speaker, and someone connected it to a playlist of gentle, old melodies that drifted like perfume through the air. The sycamore tree stood like a proud elder, its branches ready to cradle new ones. Aaliya stood near the center, breath caught in her throat. Then it began. First came the readings. Mr. Hanif stood awkwardly, then cleared his throat and read from a cookbook to make the perfect dumplings. Fold each one with care and pretend you're tucking in your childhood fears. Laughter rippled across the crowd. Then came Miss Parveen, dramatically reading the first page of Wuthering Heights like it was a Shakespearean tragedy. Next were the songs. Two teenagers, quiet boys from the edges of the village, played a folk tune on a flute and tabla. The song wasn't perfect, but no one cared. It echoed through the street like a heartbeat. Then came the wall of quiet voices. Aaliya had carefully removed the pinned poems and quotes from the shop's back wall and placed them in a box labeled Echoes. One by one, volunteers stepped forward and read them aloud. A little girl read a note that said, "I found a book here after my father passed. It made me laugh. I didn't think I could." A widow whispered her favorite line, "The world is heavy, but stories make it lighter." Then Sarah stood up. She held her blue notebook, her fingers trembling slightly, but her voice, oh, her voice, it rang clear. "I stopped writing because I thought pain had no language," she said, "but maybe it just needed a new one." And then she read. Her poem was about loss and hope, about a village stitched together by a tree and a shop and a stubborn refusal to forget the good things. Old feuds, the kind that had lasted years over missing goats and stubborn property lines, began to look small under the sycamore's shadow. Then, just as Aaliya thought the night had given all it could, the grumpy librarian showed up. Mr. Kamar from across town, always frowning behind his glasses, like the sun personally offended him. He walked straight up to Yusuf, holding a box. "I brought books," he muttered, "rare ones. Don't ask why, just take them." Yusuf chuckled. "Thank you, Kamar. I still think you organize things all wrong," Mr. Kamar added, noted. But Aaliya saw it, the tiny smile beneath the grump. Even he wasn't immune to the magic. As the evening faded into night, the lights twinkled like stars, and stories floated between sips of tea and quiet laughter. No big speeches, no protests, just connection. Aaliya stood beside the tree, heart full. She watched Sarah laughing with two kids, Mr. Hanif scribbling a recipe in the back of a book, Miss Parveen scolding someone for mispronouncing Heathcliff, and Yusuf leaning against the shop door, not as a man worried about losing something, but one who had seen it revived for that one night. The people of Elderbrook remembered who they were, not just as individuals, but as a woven, story-filled community. The shopping plaza still loomed on the horizon, but so did something bigger: hope. The morning the developers arrived, the village did not wake up quietly. From the earliest hour, people began gathering under the sycamore tree, like roots drawn to the heart of the earth. The golden light of dawn cut through the mist, casting a gentle glow over the bookshop and the village square, which looked almost ceremonial in its stillness. The construction crew, in their crisp uniforms, shiny boots, maybe they expected resistance. Maybe they expected shouting. What they did not expect was tea. Aaliya had set up a table, cups of steaming chai, plates of biscuits, and beside them, a guest book, a plain hard-covered journal titled, "Why This Tree Matters," and it was already full, written in different handwritings, ink colors, even charcoal, were hundreds of stories. My daughter took her first steps here. I met the love of my life under this tree. This bookshop saved my son's life. I buried a letter in the roots the day my father died. It gave me peace, page after page, story after story, a soft, quiet resistance, impossible to bulldoze. The crew's supervisor, a stiff-jawed man named Mr. Shah, stepped forward, blinking at the crowd. "We have a signed contract from the landowner," he began. "No, you don't," came Yusuf's voice. The villagers turned as he stepped out of the bookshop, holding a rolled-up parchment. "You had a provisional agreement with the district office," he continued, "based on the assumption that the land wasn't in use. But this," he unrolled it dramatically, "is the updated deed. The land now belongs to the village council, preserved as a historical site." "Impossible." "It's not," Aaliya replied, stepping beside Yusuf. "We gathered enough signatures to classify this shop and tree as a communal heritage space. You can check with the district registry." Her voice was clear, steady, older than it had been just weeks ago. The workers looked at one another. Then Mr. Shah sighed, not angrily. "Wasn't worth it." He glanced at the crowd once more, at the elderly couples, the children, the musicians with their flutes, Sarah clutching her blue notebook, and Yusuf standing tall beside his apprentice. "We'll confirm with the office," Mr. Shah finally said. Just like that. It was gentle. People stayed. They hugged. They smiled through quiet tears. It wasn't just a victory. It was a reunion. A remembering of who they were and what they'd nearly lost. Sarah placed a small flower crown on the sycamore's lowest branch. Mr. Kamar, still grumpy, left a copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran on the bookshop steps, saying, "It belongs here." Children chalked hearts and quotes onto the cobblestones. Hope lives here. Stories are roots. Quiet voices change everything. Later that evening, when the last of the villagers had gone home and the moon rose like a silver coin in the sky, "Been holding on to this place for too long," he said. "It was never just mine." Your grandfather knew that, and now I think you're ready." He handed her a small brass key. Around his neck, Aaliya's fingers closed around it, trembling. "Are you sure?" Yusuf nodded. "This place needs someone who listens, and you, Aaliya, have the gift of listening between the lines." The next morning, the village awoke to a new sign above the shop: "Open when you need it," painted by hand in warm, curling letters. No hours, no guarantees, just a promise. Inside, the shelves gleamed. The tea corner was restocked. Aaliya had even added a new section titled Shared Pages, filled with community-written poems, stories, and memories. The wall of quiet voices now took up an entire side of the shop, and beneath the sycamore tree, someone had carved into the bark, "She saved the summer." Weeks passed. The world continued turning. Some things changed. Others stayed beautifully the same. Sarah published a small book of poetry. Mr. Hanif opened a dumpling stall next to the shop and gave free samples to anyone who read aloud from a book first. The grumpy librarian and Yusuf began weekly debates. In the reading nook, always ending in laughter and scowls, and Aaliya. She grew. She learned to fix the kettle when it leaked, to comfort strangers, to shelve books in languages she didn't speak but could still feel. And slowly, she stopped counting the days until she could go home, because she already was home one evening as autumn painted the village in gold and rust. Aaliya sat under the sycamore with a cup of tea and her own notebook, no longer empty. She watched a little girl read to her grandmother. A couple exchanged letters they'd written just for fun. An old man hum a song that had no words. She looked at the sign, "Open when you need it," and she smiled, because somehow, in a summer that had begun with dread and silence, she had found everything: roots, wings, purpose, poetry, people. Beneath a tree older than pain and softer than memory, she'd discovered that sometimes the smallest stories carry the greatest magic, and she had become the keeper of them all. The girl who saved the bookshop, the girl who listened, the girl who stayed, the girl beneath the tree.